So many great faces out there, packed room. A lot of people want to hear about men. It's exciting. You never hear about men. It's a joke. So I want to start right off with the most important news of the day, which is the very important high-level meeting between the president and Kanye West. I have one favorite quote. There were a lot of quotes, a lot of things we could quote from that meeting. But my favorite one was, I'm going to start reading it. I love Hillary. I love everyone. Oh, sorry, Kanye West said this.
It wasn't Donald
Trump
saying I love Hillary?
That's not obvious. So I love Hillary, I love everyone, but the campaign, I'm with her, just didn't make me feel as a guy. It was something about this hat that made me feel like Superman. What do we think about that?
Well, I guess I'll start. A couple things to say. First of all, I don't particularly give a shit about Kanye West. I like him as a musician, and I'm totally fine with whatever he wants to advocate for, he can advocate for. Any thoughts that I have on this will be insignificant compared to what I was just listening to on the way home, which was Michael Eric Dyson talking tonight on Ari Melber's show. He was incredible, and as far as I can tell, off the dome, as it were. He just gave a soliloquy, like a 10-minute soliloquy about Kanye West. They did not address that specific quote, which I did think was interesting and compelling because it speaks to something pretty deep about masculinity and the notion that he would feel alienated by a candidate or a slogan being, I'm with her. It felt to me like the emphasis to him was on the word her, and that somehow made him feel, it put him back on his heels a little bit and made him feel like, I don't know, but something about following a woman maybe, or the phrase that he used as a guy, that really struck me, that he was saying, as a guy, that phrase seemed to threaten his masculinity in some capacity, and he didn't really elaborate on it. I don't know that he had thought it through, or that he could elaborate on it. But it struck me the same way it struck you.
Right. Did you think anything of it?
Well, to me, it's not so much about Kanye. Well, you know, he has admitted that he has some psychological issues, and that's neither here nor there. Pills or no pills, Kanye's doing things that Kanye should not be doing. But what is more important is that the guy sitting across the Resolute desk from him likes that, allows that, did not interrupt, did not follow up to say anything about it, will not follow up to say anything about that. And it's big because of the gender part of it. It is also big, I think, as a historical touch point to show you how small of a president we have. That he can never be in a room that is not managed, that is not a show, that is not a production where he is the star of it, and where people are not praising him. And he has treated everyone like this, including, to me, this is very much a kind of, I want the black people to dance for me. And he has done that with the historical black college presidents. He has done that with these pastors who nobody knows where their churches are. He keeps doing that and having them do that to him. And what I try to remind people is how different that is from our great presidents. I mean, Abraham Lincoln was a white supremacist, no way to argue that. When his first inauguration, he gives an inaugural speech where he says, I am going to enforce fully the fugitive slave laws, which would return anybody who escaped from slavery back to their enslavers in the South. Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave, should have been afraid, had no fear in him, and said, and wrote this scathing piece calling him an excellent slave hound. The President of the United States is a black man, a runaway slave. When they convince Frederick Douglass to come to DC, because he's complaining about black soldiers not being able to serve and to be paid the same as white soldiers. They convince him to come to DC, and while he's there, they ask him if he will come to meet with Lincoln. And to his credit, Lincoln invites Frederick Douglass into the White House. This is an adamant opponent, but he is smart. He is erudite. He knows of what he speaks. And he is your foe. And he sits across from him and listens. And Douglass leaves that meeting saying, I wasn't satisfied, but he listened to me. And they grew to become really close friends. So by the second inauguration, Douglass is invited as Lincoln's guest to after the inaugural party. That is how a president is sure of himself, is able to entertain opposing views, actually cares enough about the subject that he will invite someone who is diametrically opposed to his own position and can grow from that. This is not that kind of man. There are a lot of people who care about the issues that Kanye said he was going there to talk about, whether it's mass incarceration or whatever. Kanye knows nothing about that stuff. But he's a show, and this man likes show and cares nothing about the people behind that show. Now, that is a political issue, that is a race issue, that is a dumb masculinity issue, right? It is, my ego is so caught up in it that I cannot be diminished in front of the public, and therefore I can never allow myself to even be in the presence of someone who will challenge my supremacy.
Right.
It's just a bigger thing to me than Kanye yapping on about, and having your password be 600. So it's like, it's a bigger thing.
Wait, did everyone see this? I feel like some people might not spend their whole day on Twitter, like I do. Kanye's password is 0000000. There's a video. It's pretty impressive.
You could also not have a password if you don't want to come up with one, so that's an option.
It's a good password.
Can I just interject for 1 second? Because I do think something about that is also resonant, which is the idea that he contrasted the notion, the anti-notion of I'm with her with the positive notion of it made me feel like Superman. He said that he put on that red hat. And that I think is really telling, that he was looking for something to make him, to bolster his own masculinity, and he found it with that red hat. And that red hat has been used by millions of people to bolster what I would say are their shitty ideas of masculinity.
Right.
And you also have to get into, you have to ask these questions about, see, these are both men whose egos were bruised by Barack Obama.
Yeah.
Right? And for Kanye, it's even, an arch rival, Jay and Beyonce, were embraced by the Obamas, the same people the same man who called him a jackass. I mean, it's very interesting how all that shakes out, but it's all about like bruised male egos in that room today.
Right. And I will say, in response to you, I think being able to follow a woman makes you strong, not weak, right? And not being able to follow a presidential, not that you said that, but there's this idea that being a strong man and being a masculine man, if I'm with her, then I need to have that red hat and feel like a superhero to sort of make up for that. When being able to stand next to a woman and follow a strong woman is actually what makes you strong. And not being able to do that makes you weak. I want to follow up because I think, there's an interesting, you wrote an article today called The White Male Victimization Anxiety. And you've written a lot of different columns talking about this intersection. Yes, it's about patriarchy, it's about toxic masculinity, but what we've seen unfold I think in light of the Kavanaugh hearings, but just generally over the course of the last 2 years, and especially over the last few months, in terms of the GOP totally embracing Trump, right? Like, at a certain point after 2016 happened, I think there were a lot of people who assumed, okay, we're gonna have, you know, the Trump party and then the GOP, and now they're just one massive circus. So I just want to quote a part from your piece. So you say Kavanaugh is just one part of a much larger plan by conservatives to fundamentally change the American political structure so that it enshrines and protects white male power, even after America's changing demographics and more's move away from that power. Trump is just a useful idiot, a temporary anomaly. How does this white male victimization work? How is the GOP using it as a strategy to get more political engagement?
Well, I mean, you have to think about how politics works. So they are the people who are at the lower rungs. Basically, all these poor people could basically make one, could find common cause, but powerful people play them against each other, right? And so powerful white men who are conservatives play poor working class white men against other groups because they say it's a zero-sum game. If they rise, you fall. That's the way it works. And that has worked, and in large part because there's an existing anxiety that they're able to tap into. Older white men have one particular set of anxieties which is causing them to their life expectancy to drop. And basically they're just killing themselves. Right? It's the only group in America where the life expectancy is going down and not up. And it is all vice. It is pills, it is smoking yourself to death, it is drinking yourself to death, it is committing suicide.
Guns, yeah.
It's guns, right. So it's because, and you know, Bill Clinton calls this, you know, they're dying of a broken heart. But it's not really a broken heart. It is dying because you are unwilling to deal with an America that does not say that you are different and special, and I will always protect and secure and ensure your promotion, survival, and success, even if I don't do that for other people, which is what America has always done. Always, at the very same time that America was refusing to give those freed slaves any land, basically released them to starve to death, in which, you know, a fourth of all slaves who were freed either got seriously sick or died. A fourth. At the very same time, by an act of Congress, they were giving away hundreds of thousands of acres of land in the West and Midwest to white men. America has always said this to white men. And now all of a sudden they see the world changing in ways that they cannot change, cannot stop, and it is evening out a playing field, and for them, even means disadvantage. I have never had to start from the same place that you started from. I always started 5 spaces ahead. So that's happening on the older spectrum. The younger spectrum is rebelling for a different reason. They're being met in colleges by other college students who are saying, you have a white male privilege that you must acknowledge and that you must check so that we can all have a voice in this space. And for a while I think, well, okay, but now there is evidence in polling and research that they are rebelling against that. They're basically saying, this has nothing to do with me. They're not acknowledging that, you know, there's a lot behind your own struggle for that SAT score that made that possible. A lot of intergenerational transfers of wealth, a lot of intergenerational safety, a lot of intergenerational protection from all the forces that were gnawing at the heels of other people. But they're saying, I didn't personally do this, and that this is a discrimination against me. And so on both ends of that spectrum, there's a real raging anxiety that is causing, that allows people with the power and the real money to say, we can use this because what we want to do is to call a constitutional convention, which is what they want to do. They have 23 states already. They need, I don't know how many states they need to do this, but you don't, every constitutional amendment has emerged, so far, has emerged from Congress. They pass it by 2/3 votes, and then they send it to the states and it's ratified. These guys are saying, we can't count on a Congress like that anymore because there are too many people who don't look like us. But what we can do is take over enough states because there are enough of them with these tiny populations and they're mostly white, and if we do this in time, we can call a constitutional convention from the other side, which is allowable under Article 5, from the other side, from the state side. And because the states will call it, we know they'll ratify it because it'll be enough. They want to literally change the structure of power in this country because they see numerically it is shifting away from them.
Michael, you are a white man. You're a token white guy. That's the only reason you're here.
I love it.
I'm kidding. We're so happy you're here.
I'm happy to have my white privilege. I get to come to the
Exactly. And you use it in such great ways. And so what is going on with white men? Why are they believing in this crap and being utilized by all these rich white guys who want to, exploit their anxieties to rule the world and change everything?
Okay, so I'm happy to speak on behalf of all white men. I think Charles actually nailed it. I think you actually expressed it really beautifully. And as I was listening to you, I was thinking about how this conversation is entitled Rethinking Masculinity, and how almost immediately we started talking about Kanye and Lincoln and Frederick Douglass and slavery and our racial inheritance in this country. And those two ideas are impossible to decouple. The writer and thinker Bell Hooks talks about feminism and talks about how the feminist movement is not based on gender alone, particularly in this country, but in fact is based on, and I think she means this in order, race, gender, and class. And when you start looking at masculinity, and when you start looking at what we call patriarchy, you cannot separate those three things. And we saw that really acutely in the Kavanaugh hearings this week. That we had two privileged white people. The one who was essentially believed was the privileged white man. But if you would put that privileged white woman against, let's say, a black man, who would have been believed? All of these ideas of race, gender, and class are impossible to separate from each other, impossible to kind of untie. And so when we talk about white guys and what's wrong with white guys, it's exactly what Charles described, I think. It's exactly this sense of impending doom that white guys have, justified or not. It's what Public Enemy called the fear of a black planet. It's the shading of America away from a predominantly white country to a predominantly mixed country, a country that really represents what it was supposed to represent all along, all the people. And when you are used to a certain kind of privilege, when you're used to being sort of put at the front of the line, like when you have a fast pass at Disney, it can be galling.
Is that what being a straight guy, says able-bodied guy, feels like?
Oh yeah, you get a fast pass at Disney. Yeah, it's amazing.
Okay, great.
So when somebody's going, hey, wait a minute, you're gonna have to wait online on Space Mountain like everybody else, you go, well, I thought I got this fast pass, and it can feel aggravating, and it can feel galling, and it can feel threatening. And I think that's what's going on. What a lot of us white guys are loath to admit, because it's very hard, I think, to admit and to even see, is this privilege, is this entitlement that we get by this, by our lack of melatonin. I always get them mixed up. What's the one you take to go to sleep?
Melatonin.
It's the one you take to go to sleep.
I'm very sleepy right now.
And we have these structural advantages that are very, very hard for us to see. Because it's like those fish swimming in water, going, what's water? But when you're on land, and if you're a person of color or a woman, you look at the water and you go, oh shit, they're swimming in water. But we can't see it a lot of the time. So we resent it when it's called out to us.
Right.
But also don't want to see it.
Well, sure.
Because there are things called books. like honestly though.
Do they have books on Twitter? Because I need to check that out.
But it's just, there's actually no excuse for people not to know like a basic American history and how it advantaged some people and disadvantaged others.
But who's telling the history is a big part of the
books?
problem.
But yes, I think there's an argument to be made about like which books you read and what history is taught, because Texas, leads the way in textbooks or whatever. But this is not rocket science. Some of this is just basic understanding about what's happening around you, and I think that it is both a conscious, purposeful ignorance, and it is also a desire to see what is happening happen. It is an active participation in the oppression that people pretend not to see. When stop and frisk was raging through New York City, still happening, but there was a point in which they were stopping and frisking more young black and brown men in the city than there were young black and brown men in the city. And that was not a long time ago. That meant that if my kids weren't taking a stop, somebody across town was taking 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 for them. Fewer than 10% of those people were ever issued any summons at all because they hadn't done anything wrong. And when you have a 90% fail rate, you know that that is on purpose. There is no other program that you'd have a 90% fail rate and you would say this is a success. And every year, Quinnipiac would ask the citizens of New York City if they felt like this was okay. And every year, white people in this city said, a majority of white people in this city said, it is perfectly fine. There is no way that you didn't come across that in the news. There's no way you didn't read it in the New York Times. There's no way when we wrote that story about this kid who'd been stopped 90 plus times in 1 year, I think it was, and never charged with anything, that you didn't see that. That's a purposeful ignoring of that. Because if you understand it, if you come to know it, then you have to deal with it. And then people don't want to do that work of having to deal with what does it mean that if I gentrify this neighborhood, all of a sudden I realize that there are a lot of cops around here. Because that's exactly where they assign them. And they put those, I don't know if you guys have been to a gentrifying neighborhood in Brooklyn. I live in Brooklyn. So when you see them start to push, they put up these things they call the tree houses. It's a police unit, and it like a car jack or something, and it jacks way up into the sky. And it's like a little tree house. And they flood the streets with light. And that is a sign that your neighborhood is now one that we want to attract more people who will add to the tax base and remove more people who are using city services. And people pretend they're like, oh, that must just have always been there. No, it wasn't there. It's there because you want to walk your dog at 2 in the morning. But I think it's a conscious thing. Like, it cannot, I felt like a lot of those conversations that happen with black people, talk to other black people, talk to other minority people. Women have the same conversation where they're talking to each other. And I'm like, you know what? This is not about me. Like, the people who are benefiting from this are consciously not dealing with it. That's the problem.
Right. But I also think men don't always benefit from patriarchy, right? Coming back to Bell Hooks. Bell Hooks, if you're interested in this topic, wrote an amazing book called The Will to Change. And it's all about the idea, and she wrote this 15 years ago because she's brilliant and ahead of all of us, always. But she basically argues that patriarchy hurts men it obviously hurts women, and we know in many ways that it hurts women, but it also hurts men, right? And you've been a huge sort of voice and advocate in terms of that issue. You wrote a New York Times piece after the Parkland shooting, and talking about what you've mentioned, right? With the men are drink more, they take more drugs. I mean, even when you talk about gun violence in this country, the majority of gun deaths, although school shootings are a tragedy and are a huge epidemic, the vast majority of gun deaths in this country is men killing themselves. So the problem of suicide, like what is happening?
Specifically white men killing themselves.
Exactly, and you talk about broken men, right? Can you talk a little bit about the ways that you see, and I'm interested in how both of you feel about this.
Yeah, let me gather my thoughts for a second. When we talk about I'm not a huge fan of the word patriarchy.
Okay.
Even though I think it's apt. Mm-hmm. And the reason I don't like it is because it's almost necessarily oppositional. Because it implies a kind of male rule against a female rule, or against whatever, the people, the race, gender, class. A more useful word to me right now, anyway, is just the status quo. Mm-hmm. Patriarchy is the status quo. It is the way things are, and it is the way they have essentially always been. When we talk about the status quo, what we're talking about, in my mind, is a system of domination. Yeah. And you can say that masculinity itself is a system of domination, and masculinity itself is the patriarchy, is the status quo. It impacts men negatively for a variety of reasons. First of all, just in the level of masculinity and the way we are taught to express our masculinity, because it's a system of domination, means that you have to, as a man, to be thought of as masculine, which is a way of creating social status. You have to essentially project strength at all times. What that does, definitionally, means you cannot show weakness. It means you cannot show vulnerability. It cuts off empathy. It cuts off an enormous amount of your humanity. That enormous amount of humanity translates directly, that missing part of humanity translates directly to the patriarchy, translates directly to the status quo. So men are always in a state of competition with the world and with each other. And it really is a zero-sum game. That aspect is a zero-sum game. Because the language of masculinity is a language of constant one-upsmanship. Mm-hmm. So you're always in a position where you're essentially looking at another dude and going, could I take that guy? Metaphorically, could I take that guy? And in the end, none of us can take the other guy. In the end, all of our strength ebbs. In the end, we lose people. In the end, we need to express our pain, our grief, our vulnerability. We need to have access to this. That's how the patriarchy hurts us. It hurts us because it cuts off half of our humanity right off the bat.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that the patriarchy hurts men, too?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think Ian expressed it well. But it's one thing to have a self-inflicted wound. It's another to inflict the wound on another, which is, I think, what patriarchy does. It allows me to kill myself if I want to, but also, while I'm alive, I'm going to keep you under my boot heel. Like, that is a different feeling and access to agency that the two different parties have, even though it may be hurting everybody in the process. But I think it is absolutely true that that what it does is that it positions masculinity and femininity as binaries and as oppositional forces. And neither of those things is true. That there is a million shades of gray between what one might think of as the most feminine and what one might think of as the most masculine, and all of that is valid. And it may be a circle, it may come back, I don't know, but like all of it's valid. And what boys are taught in particular is that it is not. That there is one ideal, and you shave masculinity down to a point that it becomes spindly and fragile and breakable. And inevitably, it breaks. And the boy is now left realizing, I have no tools, no language, no mechanism to how to deal with this brokenness, because they told me you have to be this. Mm-hmm. And if I'm not able to get to that, then what am I? Who am I?
Right.
Is this still a man? And you see how tragically that spins out of control. It is either overcompensating for that in kind of street thuggery and gang life. It is violence that comes out of rejection by some girl in high school, and now I have to go shoot the whole school up because now there's nothing left for me. Mm-hmm. My whole identity is caught up in the idea that I must look a certain way, that hypermuscularity is what men look like now. I mean, America has that bad too. Like, we work out like crazy because we've been told by all our movies, all our films, that there's a certain thing, this is what men look like. All the comic books told me. Men look like this and women look like that. And that is my ideal. And I'm shooting, I'm trying to do this thing, and it is out of reach. The truth is, it is out of reach for 99% of men. And so they go through life feeling like a complete failure because they could not achieve this ridiculous, dumb definition of what being a man would be.
Yeah. And even—
Can I just tack on to that for a second? Because I think what you said is right, and I think it can manifest itself externally in terrible ways. We see that all the time. What we also see more of, I think, is the way it manifests itself internally, where men are basically given two options to react to the world. One is rage, which I think you described, the other is withdrawal. And men are forever being accused of, correctly, of not being able to express themselves, and it's because we shrink into ourselves, because we don't, as you said, have the language to get out of that. Because what we do is we erect this tower around ourselves. It's a protective tower. And that's where you get the sort of strong silent type, the stoic guy who just moves through life with his steely-eyed glance or gaze and blows into town and, you know, tells everybody what to do and goes out of town. And it's just a facade. It's just,
he cries in his cereal every morning.
Yeah. Or he tweets from his toilet. Like Donald, like, can we just acknowledge also, like, even the 1% of men who achieve this, right? Like Donald Trump is the most arguably the most powerful person in America. He sits in the White House. He can do whatever he wants. He has the nuclear codes. But how different would Donald Trump be if he wasn't so insecure about his manhood and his masculinity?
Well,
right?
I don't want to. But. There are stories. But I want to say this. I don't want to call it an achievement, because I think that it's just a natural expression of who we are. There's some guys who express naturally this thing that everybody's idealizing, but they're not trying to be. When you start to try to do it, then you are failing at it, right? When you try to change yourself from who you are fundamentally to be another person, then you've already failed at the basic human experiment of coming into the world and forcing, as Baldwin said, forcing the world to deal with you as you are and not the idea of you.
Right.
Right? Because this masculinity thing is an ideal. And you have to, at a certain point, just force yourself to look at yourself and see you and like you and be okay with you and say, this is an expression of God, nature, whatever, and I like that. And I like the diversity of this, and I am somewhere in this stew, but I like my space in it. And I'm not trying to change and be in the. I do think a lot of guys, and Trump is probably part of this, I don't want to psychoanalyze the guy, but trying to be some ideal, something, and sometimes it's just as simple as they're trying to be their dads or improve.
Get their dad's approval.
Get the approval even if the dad is not around, because there's something in their heads caught up in saying, my dad was a man. First man I knew. And if I am not like him, in every possible way, he would not be proud of me. But that's not the way nature assigns our personalities. You may not be like him, and that is perfectly fine. You have to, but it's a maturity thing. You have to come to see yourself in that way.
Right.
As a fully actualized human.
I mean, so I did this social experiment with Esther Perel, who's this amazing psychologist or therapist and superstar. And I really wanted to do this social experiment for a very long time. And when I met her, I wanted to do it with her because she's brilliant. I went to Washington Square Park with a sign that said "Free advice for men from a woman." And I wanted her there because I wanted her to actually give out advice, because I don't have that much great advice to give out. And one of the most fascinating things that I found was that a lot of men didn't feel like they were men. Right? Because, and Esther said this after a couple of hours of being out there. She said, we are born women, but we become men. And in so many countries around the world, there's these rituals, right? That you have to go out in the woods alone and, or kill a lion, literally. I mean, just, you hear these crazy sort of rituals that not just, in certain countries, but across countries, it's a very sort of common theme. And then even in the United States, there's this theory called Precarious manhood theory, and that basically is super interesting and explains this idea of becoming a man and this ideal being constantly out of reach and constantly needed to be proven. And researchers have studied it. And one of the most fascinating studies out there is when you make men braid like a piece of rope, one group of them, and the other group braids a piece, like a hair. The men who were forced to braid the hair will punch a punching bag harder than the men who were instructed to braid like a piece of rope. Right? So when you feel like your manhood is threatened, you will actively try and reaffirm it. And often it's not in ways that are positive because of what you were saying and what we've been talking about this whole time, which is, we don't give men the instruments or the tools to express their frustration, and so they go out and they.
But that's also like tied up in gay panic. That's just,
yes.
that's just they 100%. Just think like, oh my God, I might be a girl now. And that's also all in. I mean, there's that commercial a couple of months ago where the guy accidentally uses his wife's shampoo and then he starts like chopping wood and like.
I didn't see that.
You might remember this. Like he actually uses like some woman's shampoo or something, and he's like, "Oh my God!" He has to like do push-ups and chop wood and the whole thing because gay panic. I might be a woman now.
I'm gonna smell good. Oh my God, that's terrible.
What you have to do, like they put all the men's products in black bottles. You seen it at the drugstore?
Oh,
it's the same shampoo. It's put in a black bottle.
And it always says like mercury.
Yes, like extreme.
So funny.
It's really funny stuff.
It's so funny. Okay, I have questions from you guys, and I want to get to those. I also want, really quickly, there's so many things I want to talk about. I want to talk about Me Too, the Me Too movement. Louis C.K. What is the path towards, is there any path towards redemption for men who have done bad things?
Well.
Because you got slapped. Okay. This can be like rapid fire. That's
rapid fire?
I know, I want to get to it. Okay, well, no, we want to fully let you express your feelings about it. So go. In the spirit of this conversation.
In the spirit of this conversation, I wrote a series of tweets arguing that when Louis started performing again, basically saying, I don't know if the public will have him back. I don't know if he should be back. I don't know any of this, but I'm happy to see him try. And I got a tremendous amount of grief for it. And in the end, deservedly so, because I don't think I expressed myself very well. But what I was trying to communicate, and maybe I'll express it badly again, is that for men to buy into the necessity of this movement, of this Me Too movement, and I do think it is a necessity for men to buy into it. And when I say buy into it, what I mean is they have to fully embrace this part of our existence and the history of this, the problems with this, dating back forever. For men to be able to buy into that fully, I worry that they won't if they feel like they are forever facing a death sentence for their misdeeds, real or perceived. I don't give a shit about Louis's career one way or the other, but I do care about men supporting this movement. The thing that I keep thinking about in regards to Me Too isn't so much redemption, which I think is the word that I use, so much as reconciliation. This idea that there has to be I don't even want to say it's a neutral space, but a way for conversation to happen around this topic that doesn't involve permanent exile or damnation. There's a huge spectrum of misdeeds from, let's say, Al Franken to Louis to Harvey Weinstein. And you can throw Brett Kavanaugh on there wherever you want to throw him. Right. When it all gets lumped into the same thing, I think men feel a kind of existential panic, a kind of existential, oh shit, I'm the next one. Whether they did anything or not, I think there is a sense among men that they could be the next target. And that's really scary for guys, I think. So I stuck my toe into that water and was immediately slapped down.
So we're going to disagree for the first time tonight.
That's fine. As I said, I'm probably wrong about all of it.
No. But they're not dead. They're not dead.
Well,
they're very much but they're very much alive. You're not damned. You just may not be able to get $1 million Netflix special. And that is not a privilege that you have and should have access to if you've been pulling your penis out at work. I'm sorry.
No, we agree, but to me, Louis is not the point. The point isn't Louis. The point is the people who watched Louis, who are just regular guys who are watching.
And regular guys should not pull their penis out at work. I'm sorry. It's like I guess my disagreement is that I don't think you need guys to buy in, and so that they know that if I do this, there is a road back to my same position in life after I've done it. No, you don't have that. You have other access to other things that you can do, and they may be less prestigious as the one that you left, but you made a choice to do what you did, and it hurt somebody. And that there's an accountability in life for that. And that it has nothing to do with male, female. If you hurt someone in this life, you should be held accountable for that. You do not get to say, for me to support this movement, I need to know that I can do this, hit the bottom, bounce back to this spot. No, you don't get that, sir. You're not dead. Most of you have not even seen inside of a jail cell, which some of you should have. You are not dead. You still have access to all the cash you raked in while you were doing all that to those women. Mm-hmm. Now you have to make a choice about what you're going to do with the rest of your life, and it may not be able to come back to this spot. And I feel no regret, remorse, pity for that at all.
Yeah. We're essentially in agreement, I think.
No. Are you?
I think we are. Again, to me, Louis was not, it's not about Louis. It's not about $1 million Netflix specials. But it is about buy-in from men, to me. To me, for this movement to have the resonance that it has to have, and I think it has to, I think what we saw with the Brett Kavanaugh thing was a tremendous backlash against this idea of this movement. And a lot of that backlash, I think, I could be way wrong about this, had to do with, and we saw the Republicans do this beautifully, this perceived victimhood.
Yeah.
And I think that victimhood resonated with a lot of these guys, specifically because they do feel damned. They do feel like they're going to be put into exile. They do feel, correctly or incorrectly, and I'm sure you would say incorrectly, and I would agree. I will say incorrectly. They incorrectly feel victimized by this movement. But those feelings are palpable, those feelings are real, and those feelings are powerful.
They need to be afraid.
They need what?
They need to be afraid. So let me give you a historical mirror to this that is not Me Too and women. It is the South and Reconstruction. Not all those people were slave owners. They were all scared. People told them, you need to have buy-in from these white people in order for you to get along and get along. Booker T. Washington stood up at the Atlanta Compromise and basically said, we're not going to be mad at you. We're going to cast down our buckets where we are. You guys need to do business with us. We'll do business. We won't stress you out about advances, and we won't hold you accountable for all the things that you did. You don't have to be stressed out. No, that is a healthy fear. If you've done something wrong, or if you fear that you may have the capacity to harass and assault and possibly rape a woman, you need to be afraid. And we don't need buy-in from you in order to make this a legitimate thing to say a person's body is sovereign. You have no right to my body whatsoever. This workplace exists for both of us to feel safe and to do the job that we were hired to do. You have no right to make me feel uncomfortable in this space because you have power over me. You have no right to do that. And we do not need to have those people sign off on an acceptable approach to my liberty in order for my liberty to have a valid position and power and say in this country. No, we don't need their sign off. No, we don't need their buy-in.
Again, we agree. However, I want to take your analogy just another step forward because I think it's a powerful one. Reconstruction after the Civil War. To me, and believe me, I know myself to be an amateur in this, and I am looking to learn about all this shit. But to me, part of the reason that the racial legacy that we have to this day, that is expressed to this day, explicitly and implicitly, has to do with the fact that we have never had that national dialogue, that national reconciliation about our history in terms of racial relations. For that to happen, and I don't know how that happens, but there has to be, again, a kind of neutral space to reflect what is true from every side of this equation. Nobody, I think, would ever argue, I hope, today, that I had a right to your body as a slave, and you didn't have a right to mine as a slave. But we have this history, we have this legacy. And there has to come a moment where we say, let us examine all of this in the full light of day, whether it has to do with racial relations, sexual relations, whatever. And let's have that conversation. When we talk about there's this awkward space that exists right now between bad behavior, illegal behavior, where people are, there's no way to process behavior that is bad but doesn't rise to the level of illegality. Kanye West went to the White House today to talk about whatever, prison reform, criminal whatever. We have a space in our public lives right now to say, you have been to prison. We acknowledge that you have paid your debt to society, and now we want to welcome you back in whatever capacity we have, and welcome you into our society as a rehabilitated person. That's just a classic liberal point of view. But we don't have that space now for a Louis C.K. or an Al Franken. I understand your point, and it's correct.
But it's a preemptive panic, though, right? It's a preemptive panic that doesn't even allow the voice to be raised in the first place. The voice gets a little loud and everybody says, oh my God, the end point is that I kissed a girl in 8th grade, now I'm gonna be on the blacklist. No, that is a reductive way of thinking about it. It also reduces the very real impact of what is happening, and tries to infantilize all of our thinking to say that we can't discern between an actual assault and someone who is flirting like Morgan Freeman. Morgan, you're wrong. She's at work, she's interviewing you. Don't flirt with all the people who interview you. But Morgan is still employed. People were able to discern. This is inappropriate. Morgan, you need to apologize for this, but you didn't assault her. You were not her boss. You were doing this wrong. You thought you were being flattering, or maybe you did, or maybe you were just flirting, but it's not right. We know the difference between Morgan Freeman and Weinstein, and whenever we every guy goes, oh my God, I can never kiss a girl without asking first. No, don't do that, because you know better than that. What we're talking about is don't hold a 15-year-old girl down on the bed and turn the music up when she starts to scream and protest. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about don't invite little starlets who you know you have power over up to your hotel room and take your clothes off and act like you just came out of the shower and couldn't find a towel in this $8,000 suite. Don't do that. So, like, we know that. I think that when we say that men are freaked out because they think that the world will not be able to discern the difference between I stole a kiss because we were on a date, I thought that was what she wanted, and that's not what she wanted, and then I was like, oh, I was sorry about it, that's a different caliber of thing. That's a different and the world does know that, and I think when men say that they don't, they're not being honest. They're just not being honest.
And this is why I got slapped around, because you're right and I'm wrong. You're right. You're totally right. And this is where I got into trouble. I mean, you're totally right. And yet, I can't help feeling.
Okay.
I can't help feeling like.
Yeah.
There's got to be a meme that says, and yet.
I can't help feeling unresolved about this, and I don't know why. There's something that's just itching at me about it.
I think that both of you are right. I do. And because I actually think there is a middle ground there where Harvey Weinstein deserves no comeback, right? Harvey Weinstein deserves to be in jail.
Yeah.
But like, as a woman, and that's just me, I'm not speaking on behalf of anyone, okay, this is gonna be unpopular. I want them to go the Billy Bush route. Billy Bush lost his job. Billy Bush got real consequences to his actions. Okay. Billy Bush wrote an article about toxic masculinity. He wrote an article criticizing the culture that raised him to tolerate and encourage and laugh along with Donald Trump's, bragging about sexual assault. And he took a step back. He didn't try and get on some show right away. He's like, I'm gonna take some time, I'm gonna think about this, and I'm going to volunteer my time to try and change this culture. I would love to see, not to, Aziz Ansari, I think is actually in a different category, but I would love to see Aziz Ansari focus the next season of Master of None to talk about the Me Too movement, to talk about toxic masculinity, to talk and criticize this culture that hurts all of us. Work. It's not really about banishing people and being okay. Well, you're out. You can't be allowed in our society anymore. I want to reform people. I want them to reform other people. And this actually leads me to a great question we have from the audience. And I know it's almost 9, and this has been so fascinating. This has been amazing, right? It's not just me. This has been great. You guys are incredible. And I had this, and I know this is a question, I've heard over and over again. I'm sure the both of you have heard it. I have sons. What can I do to raise them? The person wrote, not to be douchebags, and then crossed it out, and then wrote, to be good men. I want to keep this. This is so great. So what is your advice? You both have sons. Mm-hmm. You both have a son. What would you give as advice?
Oh, I don't know how to answer the question. I think I'm very proud of my kids. My oldest son was the first person I ever heard saying, young man that I heard saying, all men should be feminists. Mm. And I wrote a column about that. We were driving back to school, and it wasn't, he was trying to make a big statement. He was just kind of looking out the window and talking. and the younger one kind of joined the kind of girls, women's advocacy clubs at his school.
Oh, that's so
He's
cool.
on the football team, but he's like, this is important for me to do.
Wow.
And so I don't know if it's something that you do or other than to raise them to be caring, thinking human beings, and to not try to impose on them. You see this when you have kids, you see this from the very beginning, right? So there's this pressure to like, okay, it's a girl, so it has this kind of room. And it's a boy, it's all blue, and there's trains and cars everywhere. It's like, okay, what is this about? And so starting early, just trying to not impose on them, but just throw out some blocks. You're right? Like, if she makes the stove and he makes the car, fine, but I'm just gonna throw out some blocks, right? But trying to not, but not having them be so freighted as much as I can. You can't insulate them completely because it's all around them.
Yeah.
But not having them so immersed in culture that they lose sight of humanity, and whatever springs from that basic humanity, you hope will be an empathetic, caring person, whoever they are. And I think there's just good that comes out of that. And just trying to, when you see it, when you see yourself signing your daughter up for ballet and your son up for karate and they're 5 years old and they don't want to get hit, like, maybe that's not what I should do. And maybe I should let them choose some things that they might be interested in, and also exposing them to things that they didn't think they were. So I let my daughter play in the little pee-wee baseball team. And my son didn't want to take ballet, but he took fencing, which is kind of a ballet, I think. But you letting them have some agency in it, but also being aware that society is pushing all the time on your kids, and that your job as a parent is to push back a little.
Yeah. You have a 16?
17, almost 18-year-old. The jury's out on how he's going to turn out. I think he's in pretty good shape so far. But I always think of it. I have a son and a daughter. I think of my job as a parent as actually being really simple, but hard to do. And the simplicity of it, to me, is I feel like I have two jobs, and essentially they're the same job, really one job. To let my kid know that he and she is loved. And that love expresses itself in a lot of ways. The primary way is safety. Let them know they're safe. They're safe physically, they're safe emotionally, they're safe psychologically, they're safe spiritually if they want to experiment and however they want to experiment. That safety also manifests itself in love. They know that they're loved. I tell my kids I love them every day. I hug my son, I kiss my son, I hug my daughter, I kiss my daughter. And by doing that, what I hope I'm doing is modeling a kind of behavior that I hope they will take with them into the world. Mm-hmm. It's a model of empathy, caring, compassion. I also hope I show them, both of them, at times, my own strength, my own determination, my own enthusiasm for things. I want them to see the fullness of my humanity. I know my wife wants them to see the fullness of her humanity. Mm-hmm. And by modeling those behaviors, by modeling arguments and saying, my wife and I bicker all the time, but we make up and we communicate and we talk and we hug and we kiss. By showing them what I think is a pretty decent model of adult human behavior, I hope that they will take that into the world, and I hope that in doing so, that will manifest itself as being a good man and a good woman. I hope.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, my friend Thomas McBee wrote a book called Amateur, and he was the first trans man to perform at Madison Square Gardens. Perform boxing? Does that play? Do?
Box. First box?
First box. Yeah, he boxed. I know a lot about boxing. But anyway, he gets this question all the time, and he actually told me. Not the boxing. The part about the sons, and he says, and I thought it was really interesting, to as parents, whether you're a woman, and he says it's often like a white lady question, like there's always like some white lady who got up and says, how am I supposed to raise a son in this society? And he says, start by examining your own the own way that you've embraced gender norms and that you replicate them, and how you also play into toxic masculinity. Because I think as women, we have been brought up in the same society that men have been brought up in, and sometimes we don't even realize that we are actually complicit in that as well. And so I think if everyone examined a little bit more the invisible ways that we are shaped and rethought them, we'd all be like much more freer, like chiller. It's 9:05. We've gone way past our bedtime. Thank you so much. I feel like we could go on for, we should do this again every Friday. Thursday? Is it Thursday?
Thursday.
So next Thursday, we'll do it again. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz.